having you tell me your complete name and spell it.
Now?
Yes.
Oh, Robert MacDonald, MacDonald.
Okay, and your unit that you served in?
I served in Company C of the 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment at the initiation of the 86th, but was then transferred to the 85th Headquarters 3rd Battalion after that organization was born.
And the year that you joined the 10th Mountain Division?
January 1943, January 18, 1943.
I'm going to start by having you talk a little bit about the 10th Mountain Division in general, not so much specific to you. I kind of want to have you set the stage for the arrival of the 10th. Can you explain a little bit about what the role of the 10th Mountain Division was in World War II?
It's self-explanatory. To enable organized military.
Robert, I'm going to have you start by telling me what the role of the 10th was in World War II.
The role of the 10th Mountain Division in World War II was to enable our forces, U.S. Army in this case, to face the possibility of combat in the mountainous area of Europe.
Maybe talk a little more specifically about what the role of the 10th was in Italy.
In Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a little difficult because when they actually put the division online, as they say, our functions were just the same as other infantry divisions, which were on our flanks, right and left. And we were part of what was known as the Fifth Army, which had about 8 divisions in it. So we were part of that division, part of that army. However, our special training made it possible from practically the very hour that we arrived in Italy on force to do things that the other divisions couldn't do. And we were able to oust the Germans from their high-peaked territory to our front, all the way to the north. I mean, looking from where we were, they were on the north of us. And of course, the mountains at that point were going up. We had come from the south into the mountains, and the mountains were going up as we went north, and the Germans were on top of them. It was very difficult for other non-trained infantrymen to fight in this kind of territory without some experience. and we filled that gap. And from the beginning, we didn't know it, but from the beginning, the 5th Division, the 5th Army general, who was already working on the plans for a spring offensive, which would hopefully end the war. And we still had a lot of hills to go up and a lot of Germans to get rid of. And so after a little trial run, he had decided definitely that the 10th Mountain Division would lead the 5th Army in that spring offensive, and the objective being to push the Germans off the mountains, and then they would be have to retreat into the Po Valley, which was flatter than a pancake, more or less. And they, coming out as they did, and I have to remember that there were other troops on our right flank of within the 5th Army, and the British Army, the 8th Army, which was British, was way on our right flank. So we headed the entire Allied attack into the Po Valley and broke through. And then we got down into the valley after some very difficult. The Germans were not about to give up. A lot of people think, well, why were they still fighting? I'll tell you that later if you want to know. But that was the situation. You wanted to know how we put it. The interesting thing is people have, since World War II, made studies of why our troops were so successful in the mountains and the usual flatland divisions without any special training were at great loss. They had very high casualty rates, as we did, but theirs were, we were gaining ground and they weren't. And the reason came out fairly well accepted was that they were the flatland troops, if you will, in the mountains were overwhelmed by the idea of going up those hills, and the Germans were firing downhill at them. It was just a matter of fright and loss of confidence in their ability to fight. So does that say what you want to say?
That was very good. Now I'd like to pick up with your thought about why the Germans were so adamant about keeping that ground.
Well, the immediate answer to that is that once they knew that they were at the end of the road, so to speak, those mountains stopped about 10, 15 miles beyond where we started, maybe 20 miles. And the high mountains dribbled off into rolling hills and then into the valley. And the German knew as well as anybody that if they were unable to maintain their forces in the mountains, that there was no possible way that they could win the war. And then have to, if I may add to the fact that the Germans, having by that time been in combat for several years, had behind them, out of the mountains, in the Po Valley itself, a vast network of industries and farms and whatever to keep them resupplied. And that's what enabled them to continue to fight in the hills. And of course, our response to that was to use our Air Force assets to bomb the railroads, bomb the bridges and the highways, and not to bomb the towns and the Italians. That was not considered a good idea. Of course, every once in a while a bomb went in the wrong place. But so by the time we hit the Po Valley, the roads were a mess. There were no bridges over the rivers, and we had the great joy of having to go across the Po in little boats, paddling in the little boats. So, have we strayed off the
Well, the question
question?
is, why did they want to hang on to it so badly?
That's it.
And how about if you talk a little bit about the idea that the average infantryman has an idea about what's in front of them, but not necessarily the bigger picture?
Oh, you want me to talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure I can answer what you, or say and answer what you want to hear. That's not fair, but I mean...
Well, how difficult is it for the average soldier to know the big picture?
It's very difficult. You can be in, we were quite crowded in Camp Hale. We had about 10,000 men in a relatively small valley, and you'd think everybody knew everybody else, but we didn't. We didn't know what the next company or the next battalion was doing, or the next regiment. We knew they were there. We knew where they were, but there wasn't a lot of intercourse between the men. So that's the way. Well, I have to back off a little bit. In other words, the input of information was lacked. The officers had their officers' club, and they talked among themselves and so on, but they didn't talk to the troops very much. And that's not unusual, of course, but that's the way it was. And so you didn't have any source from the outside the barracks, you might say, that knew really what was going on. There was a lot of speculation and so on about this and that and the other thing. And when there was something that leaked out, it was quickly gathered up by everybody else, like the 90 pounds of rucksack. That was no joke. They actually had people, not our people, but military people, standing at the heights of a pass and weighing the packs, the knapsacks of the troops as they marched by. So they knew it was 80 to 100 pounds, which is an awful lot of weight to carry around while you're walking. But anyway, the point is that once they did that, the word was all through the organization, the division. Everybody knew. Of course, everybody already knew that they were carrying too much weight, but nobody did much about it. So it was a lack of information, except under certain circumstances.
How about extend that thought into when you get in a battle situation? What's the difference in point of view between an officer and a frontline soldier?
Point of view, since I wasn't an officer, I can't really tell you how they saw the. Although I was familiar, I was in the battalion headquarters and very close to the battalion staff, officer staff, and part of it, I guess. Anyway, we didn't know what they were doing. Even in the battalion headquarters, we didn't know what was going on. Well, we knew when we were going to go, this was the first real operation, was to seize Mount Belvedere, which was really a problem. The word about that got around a bit, but not much. And the officers weren't talking. I was in the headquarters. We had aerial photographs that we were studying, and we knew about what was what and where. For instance, we had aerial photos of Riva Ridge, covered with snow, no tracks, no tracks of humans or horses or vehicles of any kind. It was just plain snow, which that made a lot of difference in the planning for the attack on Riva Ridge. The opposite came into play as far as Mount Belvedere is concerned, because there were all kinds of rumors about how many men, Germans, were up there and ready for us, and so on and so on. But no one really knew. And the photographs didn't show, because they were actually, it was only an observation post. There were only about 10 or 15 men up there, and no weapons to speak of, a few machine guns and so on, but nothing.
How difficult is it for the average soldier, private, to know what's going on? What do they know?
Very little. They know that somebody's shooting at them. That's one thing. You might think they'd been told in advance what was going to happen, or they were supposed to do. It was and it wasn't, because when you get right to the bottom of it, the orders that are put out through the officer command down to company commanders, more or less, through different headquarters. But we tried to arm the company headquarters with maps that showed where they were to go and which direction, and who was what was where. I mean, where the Germans were and what kind of weapons they had, and so on and so on. That's okay. But then when you cross that line, everything's different.
Okay, hold.
Oh,
Tell me
hanging my head.
Tell me how it's different and why it's different.
Well, there are a number of reasons. One is that we might have set out patrols that would, some penetrated through the enemy lines and got to see things behind, but they were mostly night patrols, so that they wouldn't be caught. And their reports were made back through headquarters channels, not not in the company itself sent to patrol. And what they saw behind the enemy lines, if they saw anything at all, in some cases they didn't, was simply, well, there's a collection of men here and weapons. We saw some artillery or whatever, some machine gun nests all prepared for battle and so on. But those reports never got to the men who had to go into that area. And so even if you knew what was there, when the patrol reported back, by the time we got in, across the line, it was different. They moved. The Germans were very mobile in the sense that if they were on a machine gun, or they had 2 or 3 machine gun nests supporting each other, but if they got too much artillery fire from us, or the danger of, they moved. So if somebody was fired on yesterday from this position, today they moved up the hill and to the left. So that's what I meant by things have changed. And the one of the reasons why we were able to get Mount Belvedere without being thrown back and so on was that the usual counterattacks didn't happen. The Germans were great for not necessarily letting, but taking care of little breaks through their lines with counterattacks. In some cases they were organized and men had practiced and all that sort of, the Germans had practiced. In this case, up on top of Mount Belvedere, when we finally got there, there was a change of units going on during that night when we crawled up the mountain. We took a lot of artillery fire and mortar fire from behind the mountain, and there were some couple of machine gun nests on the mountain, but there were very few men. And why? Because
they were all being, the two units were changing their sights. The men that were up on top of Mount Belvedere were leaving and being replaced by Germans who had just arrived in the theater or just arrived in that area, didn't know anything about the territory except they were to go up on top of that mountain and hang on. So that's the way things can change. That was a big change, and it enabled us to get to the mountain, not only take it, but to keep it. So there were no counterattacks against Mount Belvedere in those first 24 hours or so.
Can you revisit for me what you said about being at the top of passes during training and actually having the rucksack weight?
Well, I wasn't there, but basically, as I imagine it, they had some kind of a big commercial weighing scale. They would take, let's say, every fifth man and take his rucksack off, weigh it, and send him on his way. So then they would have a pretty good idea. Was it every pack or just some? And was there an average or whatever? That's the only way I can see it being done properly that would give them what they wanted to know. The unfortunate thing is that we were never able to get much less in our rucksacks because being mountain troopers, we had to be fairly self-sufficient with sleeping bags and in some case cooking materials when we had some kind of mountain ration, which never got adopted because it wasn't a very good idea. So there they were, and I wasn't there, but I can see a clump of people at some point in this pass, not necessarily the top. Anyway, onlookers who were actually doing the weighing and all that sort of stuff, and the men were probably in single file. They weren't marching up the mountain 2 or 3 abreast and keeping track, 1, 2, 3, 4. It was take 2 more steps, and when you can't take any more, take 2 more. That was how you kept going, with all that weight and all that, the problem of going up a hill with all that weight was part of this study. I don't know that can't go any further than that. I don't know what they really did.
Tell me a little bit about the expertise and quality of the officers.
Oh, that's a bad one. There was a great deal of friction between officers and enlisted men for several reasons. But one has to start at Camp Hale, because there was the only troops that were supposedly being trained for mountain work was the 87th Mountain Infantry Regiment in Fort, what is it? Fort Riley.
Well, Fort Lewis.
Fort Lewis. Fort Lewis in Washington, which was 60 miles away from any mountains. It was a very flat place. Anyway, the man who took over the function of filling up a battalion from scratch was somewhat ahead of the game, so to speak, because he saw these people coming in, college graduates, most of them at the beginning, and they came in and presumably would go to basic training, unless they'd already been in basic training, 13 weeks or so of basic training. And so these guys came in, and there was no basic training at Fort Lewis. They had to be sent to some other place. But Colonel Rolfe, who was the commander of the battalion, arranged through back door what do you call it, meetings with people, or having people that he could talk to. He took many of the first people that came in and had them sent to training, basic training, if they hadn't had it, and after basic training, went to the OCS, Officer Training School, Officer Candidates School at, well, there were several around the country, and I came back to the battalion, and so they were skiers and hunters and mountain climbers and whatnot. They were already in their middle 20s and 30s in some cases, whereas the other people coming in later on, well, we haven't got the officers back yet, but when the officers came back, they were I wouldn't say they were buddies. There was always a little opposition, whatever, between the troops and the officers, because the officers had so many privileges and whatever. They dressed well, their uniforms were neat. They were, if they went any place in the town, the girls would flock to the officers, it was that kind of thing. But and that went on. After a while, there were so many people coming in that first 6 months or so of Fort Lewis, that they had to have they had to set up their own basic training post. And then from that, they took men, sent them to officer training, and had them come back to the unit, which was against Army practice, and I don't know, probably against their rules too. But because you have a couple of friends, let's say, in a battalion or in a company, they're very friendly with each other, and several. One of them goes to officers' school. When he comes back, you can't put him in that company, because those other 2 or 3 guys are either jealous or hurt because they weren't selected, or all kinds of friction just the fact that it's an officer. And it worked that way up at, now the other thing happened when we got up to Camp Hale. A large number of men had been trained as officers and commissioned by the time we got to Camp Hale. But Camp Hale was set up for 10,000 men, and it was largely run in the old military way of how you run a post. You know, there are certain functions you do and don't and so on. And in this case, the mountain trainees were declared essential and could not be sent to schools off the base, off of Camp Hale territory. There were opportunities for 3 men a month to go to OCS. We needed 30 in a month. So what happened was that since we had stopped, or the Army had stopped sending experienced mountain climbers and skiers and hunters and all the rest, they couldn't go anymore. They brought in ROTC graduates and guys just out of Fort, wherever it was, training, officer training, brand new spiffy uniforms and shiny bars, and they didn't know up from down. I mean, that's a bad way to put it, but there are worse ways to put it. Anyway, so they tried to use, or started out using the kinds of discipline and activities that they were taught at the officer training school, which were for flatlanders, if you want to put it that way. And it didn't work. And well, there was a comment in the book, The Last Ridge, about brand new officers taking men out with full packs and having them march in step up a trail or something until they just couldn't do it anymore. They had to stop. So the men got very upset about that sort of thing. They weren't buddies with the officers. They didn't have anything in common. A few of them were skiers or mountain climbers or anything, outdoorsmen. They were all young. Well, we had 18-year-old kids come in with fresh out of school with their bars and no, they didn't even shave. They were so young. It was, and in the long run, that caused considerable, or resulted in considerable gaps between the officers and the men. Especially, the men were obviously, when I talk about the men, I'm talking about the troops as a whole, and there were, generally speaking, I lost my train of thought. Anyway, they were yeah, I did lose my train of thought. I can't think of what I was going to say at the point.
Okay.
Erase that.
Let me stop right now change tapes.
Okay.
It's an excellent